We are very pleased and honored to have a discussion today with Father and Dr. Christopher Knight. Can I ask you to introduce yourself?
As you said, my father, Christopher Knight, I'm a priest of the Orthodox Church. I'm within that archdiocese of parishes of Russian tradition in Western Europe, but which is under the ecumenical patriarch. I've only been a member of the Orthodox Church since 2002. I was originally a priest of the Anglican Church, although my interest in Orthodoxy actually goes back to even before the time I thought about being trained for ordination in the Anglican Church. So my interest in Orthodoxy goes a long way back, but I only finally made the move in 2002, which was at least 20 years after I first considered the possibility.
Father Christopher, you are one of the leading experts in the fields of Orthodox Christianity and science. You have written in various fields on this theme. How did you decide to work on this subject?
Well, the important thing, I think, is that my original academic background was in astrophysics. So I had a strong interest in the sciences from really quite an early age. And it was only after being ordained in the Anglican Church, I think, that I thought that this was a very important topic. And at that time, and we were talking now about the mid-1980s, there was a body here in England called the Science and Religion Forum, which had been set up by Arthur Peacock. And I started going to some of their regular annual conferences. And it was largely through that, I think, that I thought, well, this is an area which, with my background in astrophysics and now a background in theology, I really ought to get involved with. And I actually consulted Arthur Peacock about this and said, well, how can I best do this? And he said, well, the best thing really for you to do at this stage of your life is to get a job as a chaplain or dean in one of the Cambridge or Oxford colleges, because if you do that, you'll work very hard pastorally for half the year with the students and with the college community, but you'll have about half the year to actually focus on this whole issue of science and theology. So I took his advice and became, in fact, the chaplain and the fellow and the director of studies in theology at Sidney Sussex College in Cambridge, which is very close to where we're sitting now. And while I was there, another major figure in the science theology movement in the West, who was John Polkinghorne, arrived in Cambridge, and he encouraged me to start doing some teaching on this subject for some of the colleges of the university. So I gradually got involved in what was often called the science theology dialogue. Indeed, the paper I was teaching on in Cambridge at that time was called The Modern Dialogue Between Science and Theology. But I fairly quickly, as I started doing that, found that many of the things that were assumed in that dialogue I didn't feel entirely comfortable with. And I think it was largely through that my interest in Orthodox perspectives, which, as I say, had actually started many years before, started to play a part in the way I started thinking about science and theology. And in fact, it was at a conference in Windsor in, I think, 2001 that I was invited to give a paper. This was a conference on the topic of panentheism, the relationship between God and the world, and the idea that in some sense the world is in God. And at that conference there were papers also by Metropolitan Kostas of Dioclea, by Professor Andrew Louth, and by Alexei Nestoruk himself, which convinced me that in a sense the Orthodox had a lot to say about this particular topic. And it was relatively soon after that that I finally made the decision that my old focus on orthodoxy really required me now to become orthodox and so to speak, do the science theology dialogue from within orthodoxy rather than being an outsider who took an interest in orthodox perspectives.
Mm. I see. You sort of preemptively answered my next question, but I wanted to ask, what were influential books or scholars that inspired you in your journey towards your current position?
Well, on the Orthodox side, long before I even thought about training for the ministry of the Anglican Church, I had a strong interest in what Vladimir Lossky, for example, was saying. And certainly there were people in this country like Metropolitan Kostas of Dioclea, whose books were very influential on me. On the science and theology side, I think probably Arthur Peacock was to me the most interesting scholar who was working at that time, partly because it seemed to me that he had what I sometimes call a theological instinct, which was a very strongly sacramental one, which was characteristic of one strand of the Anglican tradition, and certainly it was the strand of Anglican tradition which I felt most comfortable with. So I think it was through some of his early writings that I found myself moving in a particular direction. But I eventually found myself sometimes saying to Arthur, well, it seems to me your instinct is taking you in a certain direction, but for me, you're not quite taking it far enough. So, as I say, those were the sorts of influences on the science and theology dialogue, very much the view of Arthur Peacock, and from the Orthodox side, the work of people like Vladimir Lossky, and also to some extent people like Schmemann, for example. I mean, Schmemann's, again, focus on the sacramentality of the created order seemed to me to fit in very nicely with some of the things that Peacock was trying to explore. But it felt to me as though Schmemann, because he was coming from the Orthodox tradition, had a much richer set of resources, if you like, than Peacock did, coming as he did largely from a particular strand of the Anglican tradition.
Some of your recent work has focused on an Orthodox perspective of the science and religion dialogue. Would you like to share your views on the subject?
It seems to me that much of what's been good about the Western science theology dialogue has been undermined by something which is built into, I think, a lot of Western assumptions about the relationship between God and the created world. In particular, I think you can go right back to the patristic period, and you can see in Augustine, for example, a separation of grace and nature, which really defined the way that Western theology thought about the created order for much of the next 1,000 years. To some extent, it was modified in scholasticism, modified actually in a good way, I think. But nevertheless, there is still the assumption, I think, by most Western scholars that the created order has been created by God, certainly, but is in some sense autonomous. It runs by laws of nature which God has given it, but where the presence of God in the world and the presence of the world in God, so to speak, is underestimated. And it seems to me that this is where Orthodoxy has resources which can question that whole approach. In particular, in St. Maximus the Confessor, the very sense that the Logos of God, who was made incarnate in Christ, is present in the world through the logoi of created things. That seems to me to be a very important resource. You could also see another sort of panentheism of that sort in St. Gregory Palamas, for example. So it seems to me that that's one of the main contributions that Orthodoxy can make to this particular discussion. And indeed, interestingly, there's a young scholar called Sarah Lane Ritchie, who is now in St. Andrews University, who's talked about what she calls a theological turn in thinking about, well, particularly the question of divine action, but more generally the relationship between God and the world. And she notes that not only I, but also one or two people in Western traditions, some in the Pentecostalist charismatic tradition, even one or two people within the scholastic tradition, are starting to question that sense that so many Western theologians have, that the world is somehow autonomous. And therefore the real problem is that of how God gets into the world from the outside, so to speak. If God isn't outside the world, if God is automatically in the world, whether we see that in terms of the logoi of St. Maximus, or whether we see it in terms of the Spirit as is emphasized by the Pentecostal tradition, then we tend to see the problems in a very different way, and we tend to come up with very different answers from that perspective. Another issue, I think, is one which is to do with theological language. Again, I suppose the influence of Lossky on me and my early explorations of Orthodoxy means that I have a very strong emphasis on the whole apophatic tradition, the sense that what we say about God is inevitably limited, that we can never circumscribe the reality of God by the words that we use. And again, I think there are aspects of the Western science theology dialogue which make certain assumptions about both theological language and scientific language, which can actually be questioned from an orthodox point of view, as well actually as from a normal philosophical point of view. There are some philosophers of science, for example, who I think have said very interesting things about the nature of scientific language, which by and large haven't been taken on board by Western theologians, but which actually fit in very nicely with aspects of the apophatic tradition as we know it in the Orthodox world.
On that note, and focusing a bit more in some of your work, you have also written on natural theology on the Eastern Orthodox tradition. Natural theology is and has been one of the hallmarks of science religion studies in the Western tradition, both historically and some have argued theologically. So, would you like to share your views on the subject of natural theology in the Eastern Orthodox tradition?
Right. Well, one thing I think, it's interesting that when I first got involved in this world in the 1980s, there was actually in the West quite a strong reaction against certain strands of natural theology as they developed in the West, because there was the assumption, not in all natural theology, but in quite a few of the strands of natural theology in the West, that you could somehow move from the world to the reality of God in a straightforward philosophical way. And as I say, there was a reaction against that, and somebody like Ian Barber, for example, would say that we no longer want to do natural theology in that sort of way. We want to do what we might call a theology of nature, which doesn't have a straightforward movement from philosophical arguments or the way the world is to God, but starts with a particular religious tradition and religious understanding, but then asks how the language we use of God and the language we use of the created world, how they sort of fit together and how they might affect one another. Now, when I was asked to write something about natural theology, from the Orthodox point of view, it struck me that one of the things that was characteristic of Orthodox natural theology is that within Orthodoxy, although there was a great deal of sort of philosophical talk about these issues, there's also a sense of the limitations of philosophy, the sense that you could never do philosophy without certain assumptions being made which may be questionable. And in particular, a very strong sense that the role of the Christian life, and indeed the role of the theologian particularly, is actually to talk not just on a theological basis, but from the basis of an existential experience. So in the traditional way of talking about these things in the patristic era, you would, for example, have a strong sense on the nous, which is a concept which is well known in Orthodox theology, but actually in Western theology has largely been put aside as something which people talked about in the Middle Ages, but is no longer really something that we can talk about. Now, one of the things I've been writing about quite recently is precisely how that concept of the nous, not necessarily exactly in its traditional form, but at least in some form, perhaps gives us some sort of insight into both what it means to be human, but also what it is to do theology, so that it is in some sense the enlightened nous, the cleansed nous, which allows us to then go on to build on what I've sometimes called a theological instinct, which comes through that unspoken intellectual capacity, to then talk in philosophical language about God. But nevertheless, it's not natural theology in quite the form it was in the scholastic tradition, where the assumption was that there were simple arguments for the existence of God from a philosophical point of view, or the slightly later arguments which tended to talk about the way the apparent design of the world could lead straightforwardly to a belief in the existence of God. So I think Orthodoxy has a strong sense that, yes, philosophical language has its place in theology, but ultimately our sense of the reality of God, it belongs at that deeper level, not at the level of philosophical speaking about God.
In your first book, a widely acclaimed book, Wrestling with the Divine, you tackle several themes, ranging from the nature of miracles to recent philosophy of science, which you already mentioned, to religious experience. Would you like to present the argument of the book for us?
Well, I'd perhaps first like to say that that book was written before I became Orthodox, and it was one that was very much aimed at a Western audience, although it had certain Orthodox themes there. So there are certain aspects of that book as it exists now, which was published in 2001, but I actually finished writing it, I think, really about 6 or 7 years earlier. But one of the things that I was trying to do in that book, and which was taken up in my later book, The God of Nature, as well, from a slightly more orthodox point of view, was the idea that we don't want to make a distinction between the way the world works, which is open to our scientific investigation, and God's action in the world. That in fact, there's a very strong sense within Orthodoxy, but also I think that, in other traditions of theology as well, that where we see natural processes at work, God is working in and through these processes. And this is something which perhaps I initially picked up from Arthur Peacock's work, and he and others talked about the way in which God acts in, with, and under the laws of nature. So one of the things that I was trying to do in that book was to find ways of speaking about that. One of the ways I did that was on this sacramental basis that we're talking about, in which I actually drew together what I called Peacock's pansacramentalism, even though it was instinctive, I think, rather than very often written about in his work, and the sort of understanding of the sacramental nature of the world that we see in people like Alexander Schmemann, who I mentioned earlier. Now, it's true that with that, I was talking not just about divine action in general, I was also talking about religious experience. And here, one aspect of that book that some Orthodox might be less than comfortable with was my sense that we have a human psychology which is naturally oriented towards God, and that therefore we don't want to see Christianity as the only legitimate way in which God can be spoken about, but we also want to recognize that in any faith tradition there will be aspects of the way in which that ultimate reality is talked about, which we can affirm. And of course we can see this also way back in the patristic period. If we look to the 2nd century apologists, for example, we see there already a sense that God has built into the Greek philosophical tradition, for example, ways in which he can be apprehended, not apprehended fully, but nevertheless things that we do actually want to affirm. And saints like Clement of Alexandria had a very strong sense that there were things within the Greek philosophical tradition, not least perhaps there was a Greek tradition of natural theology long before there was a Christian one, which we want in some way to affirm. And so one of the things that I was doing in that book was pointing out the way in which what's sometimes called a pluralistic approach to the faiths of the world in fact sits very nicely both with that sort of sacramental emphasis which I see in Orthodoxy and also in some Western scholars, but it also sits very nicely with certain patristic perspectives. And there have been Orthodox scholars like Philip Sherrard, for example, who have written about that sort of element of how we understand the faiths of the world. And I think we do have to be careful in Orthodoxy not to assume that Orthodoxy contains all the truth and there is no truth outside it. Coming from a different Christian tradition, I can see the good things and the bad things of the particular Western Christian tradition in which I was brought up. But I think we also need to look at other faith traditions as well and recognize that they're not simply, in some sense, opposite to the truth that we see in Orthodoxy in its fullness, but in some sense, just as the Greek philosophical tradition did before Christianity itself, we can see a sense in which God is leading us towards himself in and through those inbuilt human capacities, which are there partly through our ability, to think philosophically, but also through what we might call our religious instincts. As human beings, we have those religious instincts. And indeed, a relatively recent interest of mine, which I haven't really published on yet, is the whole issue of how evolutionary perspectives fit into that. There's some very interesting scientific speculation going on at the moment about what's sometimes called the evolution of religion. I think that's actually a bad term. I prefer the term evolution of religiosity. But nevertheless, I think that work is going to present some very interesting questions for theologians over the next decade or two, and I hope to be part of that conversation.
Mm-hmm. You've already mentioned your next, more recent book, The God of Nature, which again tackles several themes, among them incarnation and the importance of divine purpose and its confirmation, among many others. Could I ask you to present your views on how these subjects touch upon the science and religion dialogue?
Yes, I think the topic of incarnation obviously is not only central to Orthodox belief, but it also, particularly through the work of St. Maximus the Confessor, it affects the way in which we look at the whole created order. The way in which St. Maximus talked not only about the divine Logos incarnate in Christ, but also the way in which he saw what he called the logoi of prophetic utterance and the logoi of all created things were in some sense a manifestation of the divine Logos in the world. So I think that through that, but though one could also approach it through St. Gregory Palamas and the idea of divine essence and energies, one has a very strong sense that those processes which are open to our exploration through the sciences are in fact processes in which God is directly present. He hasn't simply created them and then, so to speak, become a distant God watching these things happen. That was the view of the deists of the 18th century, but it can't be a view that's true to Orthodoxy nor to any sort of traditional Christianity. But it seems to me that once you take that into account and you see the incarnation not only as a particular historical event, so to speak, but it is something that is built into the way in which God from the very beginning saw the created order. So that what one Western scholar has called almost a gradual incarnation happens, that what happens in the person of Jesus Christ actually has its beginning in the act of creation itself. And once you take creation seriously in that sort of way and see that the incarnational perspective allows us to see it in that particular way, then what sometimes seems to some people to be my emphasis on naturalism becomes theologically something which is very potent. Because I think again one of the great problems with that concept of naturalism is that we tend to define it in far too narrow a way. Some people define it very much in terms of what the sciences can uncover. And one of the things I've argued is that the sciences uncover aspects of the natural but don't uncover everything, because quite simply the methodology of the sciences, for example, there are certain aspects about what it is to be personal which simply can't be touched by the sciences, even though the sciences do give us some real insights into what it is to be a human person. So naturalism for me really means the way in which the created order works in relationship to God. And because of that way of looking at it, it seems to me that one of the things that's often done in Western theology, which is to make a distinction between what's called general divine action and special divine action. General divine action meaning that which happens simply because the laws of nature have been designed by God in a benign way. Special divine action, the idea that God somehow from time to time looks at what's going on in the world and says, okay, I'll do this because that's happened or whatever. It seems to me that that distinction gets away from the sense that God is present and active in all events, in all processes. And that therefore to make that quite strong distinction, which is often made in the West, actually isn't true to the reality of a universe which was from the very beginning designed so that the incarnation could actually happen. And again, we have this is part of our Orthodox tradition. There is a strong sense that the incarnation is an eternal reality, not just a historical event. The historical event obviously is a manifestation of that eternal reality in time, at a particular place. But this very strong sense that the incarnation is ultimately about the way in which the created order has been created and designed by God in such a way that his action, so to speak, is already present in everything that happens. Now, that doesn't mean that bad things don't happen. Obviously, we have what's sometimes in the West called the problem of evil. And again, it's interesting to me that Orthodoxy has a way of approaching this, at least in part through the idea, in the patristic era, you get it particularly in St. Gregory of Nyssa, of the garments of skin, the idea that the original paradise, so to speak, is something which is different from the world that we actually experience, that the world we experience is one that's appropriate to human beings who have rebelled against God and need to be brought back to God. Panayotis Nellis, among modern theologians, I think has written extremely well on that. So again, it's fascinating to me that these issues, which start off, so to speak, as philosophical issues, can actually find in the Orthodox tradition ways of speaking about them which aren't purely in terms of philosophical language, but they're fundamentally theological as well.
You've already mentioned Maximus the Confession several times, and his work seems to be very influential to many current theologians who are especially interested in the direction of Orthodox Christianity and science. Do you agree with this direction of research? What makes his theology or his writings so appropriate for an Orthodox dialogue with science?
I think it's partly because he does directly address, not on his own, he's building on what the whole patristic tradition had tried to develop up to his own time, but he is, at least in part, focusing on the created order and the nature of the created order. Now that's of immense importance, and not least because it tends to be a corrective to our tendency in a modern scientific age to see the world as in some sense autonomous, as separated from God, which God has to interact with, as I say, from the outside, so to speak. So in that sense, I think he is very important. It's interesting that in terms of the history of Orthodox theology, he was not considered as important 100 years ago, perhaps, as he is now. And certainly in the West, there's been real interest in St. Maximus over the last 40 or 50 years as well. So in a sense, he can actually act as a sort of bridge between East and West as well. You get major theologians, Lars Thunberg, Hans Urs von Balthasar, for example, within Western traditions, looking with real interest at St. Maximus himself. But from the point of view of the science-theology dialogue, I think it is very much the sense that there was not only a focus on the created order in Maximus, but there was a focus on the created order, which I think can provide all sorts of very interesting insights, not least, as I say, those which tend to correct these distortions in our ways of looking, which seem to us to be natural in a scientific age, but which from a theological point of view really do need to be questioned.
After so many years working as an active scholar on the field, how do you see the current status of the science and religion studies or field or dialogue? How do you see the field moving forwards in the future?
That's a very interesting question, because it's not clear to me that the questions are as obvious as they were in the past. When I go back to when I was first involved in the field, questions about the use of language and questions about divine action were really absolutely central. At the moment, there are other focuses, not least, of course, on what it is to be a human being, and both evolutionary perspectives, but also perspectives from our understanding of the way the brain works, for example, the relationship between the brain, the rest of the body, and what we see as our cognitive functions. That is something which at the moment is exciting a lot of interest. My own belief is that, in fact, there's a tendency to think that the questions that were being asked 30 years ago have now been answered. My own feeling is that actually they haven't been answered adequately. And I do hope that, as I say, what Sarah Lane Ritchie has called the theological turn in discussions of divine action might get us back to some of those more, what to me at least, are more fundamental questions. But there's no doubt that the way in which things are likely to develop over the next 10 or 20 years will certainly include all these questions on what is it to be a human person. Because one of the good things that's come out of the dialogue, I think, is that tendency to think of ourselves as a sort of body and a soul in some sort of loose association, that's now by and large been set aside. And of course it's put us back to a much stronger orthodox basis where we've often seen, or usually seen, the body and soul, or the body, mind and spirit, as components of a unified being. Now, that's the good side of what's come out of this, but there is always the tendency to reduce everything to brain processes or whatever. And again, there's some very interesting philosophical work on what's sometimes called emergence, which is trying to say, look, we can't just reduce what it is to be a human to these processes. But of course, the more we know about these processes, the more, in fact, we will be asking more refined questions on what it is to be truly human. And whether, whether those questions arise from evolutionary perspectives, whether they arise from perspectives which come from sort of brain scanning and the study of brain damage, for example, it does seem to me that over the next 20 years, those will be major factors. And again, I think the orthodox sense of what it is to be human will have an important part to play in that, because orthodox psychology, if we want to call it that, or the orthodox sense of what it is to be human, actually is much more sophisticated than the sort of philosophical understanding which was there in the early modern period in the West, where they simply talked about the body and the soul, and they tended to identify the soul purely with the conscious mind. We now have an opportunity, I think, to put that very complex and sophisticated orthodox psychology into this whole discussion and see where it goes.
You again sort of preempted the next question, which is about the characteristics of Orthodox Christianity and Orthodox tradition that set it apart from other Christian denominations when considering its directions with science. There are some scholars that have very strongly argued, Alexei Nesterov, for example, that the Orthodox tradition has elements and basic constituent, theological constituents that make it even more suitable to these kinds of discussions with science. What is your view on the special characteristics of Orthodox tradition regarding science? Are there any?
I think there are. Alexei Nesteruk's own approach, which is very much been influenced by the philosophy of phenomenology, is one which I respect, but I think tend to take him in a direction which says, well, what in the West has sometimes been called the dialogue between science and theology, in fact is meaningless, if you like. He often says the term dialogue is not a good one, and I would actually agree with that. It's not the best term that we can use. Nevertheless, it does seem to me that one of the things which is characteristic of orthodoxy is, first of all, what I've called its sacramental focus, its sense that the created order is such that it can become, or to some extent always is, transparent to the purposes and the glory of God. That sacramental character, which has been talked about by Schmemann, who I've mentioned before, by Philip Sherrard in a slightly different context, is something which it seems to me is really quite important in the way in which we look at the way the world is, and therefore the way we understand how science begins to unpack some of that sacramental character. So that's one of the first things. And the second thing is, as I've said before in a slightly different way, because Orthodoxy has, through St Maximus and through St Gregory Palamas particularly, this sense that the world is in God, the sense that God is present in the world in all its processes, it does tend to pose the questions that we think are there in science and theology in a slightly different way. Now, having said that and seen something very positive in that, I do think I need to say that sometimes Orthodoxy is presented to the world as though insights from the 20th and 21st centuries really should have very little impact, if any, on the way in which Orthodox talk about these things. Now, it seems to be that that's fundamentally wrong for two reasons. One is that many of the people who speak in this way, perhaps not all, but many of the people, have taken up something of what's sometimes called the culture wars mentality. And they tend to identify science with something that others call scientism, the idea that only science can ever give you legitimate answers to the questions that you have. Now, clearly I, as an Orthodox priest, don't believe that, but many scientists don't believe that either. They see science as an important part of our investigation of the world, but not the whole of it. So I think there is this tendency to say it's science versus religion, which in fact is historically only one of many ways in which science and theology have interacted. With that, there's often a tendency to say that certain modern scientific theories, like evolution, in its neo-Darwinian form, is somehow fundamentally opposed to Orthodox understanding. I believe that that's not the case. I believe it very often relies on a rather selective reading of the patristic witness. And I believe indeed that many of the things that I've talked about actually allow us to see in the evolutionary process the way in which God actually works. I'm not pushing God aside by saying that the evolutionary perspective seems to me a good one and a fundamentally sound one. I'm simply saying it allows us to see in a new and clearer way the way in which God has actually acted in the process of creation. But having said that, I think there are some Orthodox responses to science which are not particularly helpful. I do think, as I've said, that Orthodoxy has so much to give to the science-theology dialogue. And indeed, I've sometimes said in what I've written that it does seem to me that in the whole science-theology dialogue across the Christian world, and perhaps even beyond, it may well be that Orthodoxy can really affect the way in which questions are asked, the way in which they're pursued. But there will also always obviously be things that Orthodox do have specifically for themselves, or at least within the wider Christian context. One of the things it seems to me that the apparent relationship, for example, between what I've said about St Maximus, with its focus on the logoi, the second person of the Trinity, and what some modern scholars in the charismatic tradition are now saying about the Spirit, it seems to me that that actually unpacks in a very interesting way that sense that St Irenaeus had, that the Father, that the Son and the Spirit are the two hands of the Father, and the way in which the Cappadocian Fathers, for example, had a very strong sense that all action in the world is Trinitarian action. Now that, it seems to me, is something that can actually be helpful to Orthodox theology as well. It can actually emphasise aspects of that which perhaps are sometimes underemphasised in the way that we speak about these things.
This was a very clear answer, which leads me to ask, what areas remain especially underexplored in the Orthodox science interaction? Which issues in particular do you think Orthodoxy and Orthodox tradition should be more deeply addressing in the 21st century towards interaction with science?
Well, as I've said, it does seem to me that the exploration of the human person is something which, quite apart from Orthodoxy, is going to be very important over the next 20 or 30 years. And as I've again already said, it does seem to be that Orthodoxy has very particular insights here. Again, sometimes those insights aren't expressed terribly well because there is this sort of slight fear of modern science, of modern psychology, of evolutionary perspectives. But nevertheless, it seems to me that if we can get over those fears, then we can begin to address that sort of question of what is it to be a human being, both from a theological perspective and from a scientific perspective. And we can allow that sort of interaction between those two perspectives to be a very positive one, I think, for both. So I would certainly say that's one of the issues which is there. But going back to my original thing about the way that God acts in the world, it does seem to me that if we are to really affect the wider dialogue, then this Western tendency to see the world as autonomous, which God must somehow affect from the inside, that for me is still the prime thing that Orthodoxy can really grapple with and can have a real effect on the way in which the dialogue goes, as I say, well beyond the bounds of Orthodoxy.
I will have a couple of questions more. What are or should be, from your point of view, the limits of the dialogue or interaction between science and Orthodox Christianity?
One limit, obviously, is that we do regard our faith as being something which is revealed to us by God. Now, how we talk about revelation, again, is something which I think Orthodox possibly need to explore more than they have in the past. And there's been quite an interesting discussion of that in the West, with some Orthodox input going right back to the 1930s and 40s. But nevertheless, there must be a sense in which there is a sort of fundamental core to our Orthodox faith, which in a sense we can explore, but we don't want to give up. Now, interestingly, that exists in the sciences as well. One particular philosopher of science, Imre Lakatos, has talked about the way that scientists work with what he calls core theories and auxiliary hypotheses. And that can sometimes be really quite helpful in our thinking. And indeed, it was talked about in one of the early books of Nancy Murphy, that there is a core to our Orthodox faith which effectively is untouchable. But when we talk about auxiliary hypotheses, well, we've got to be very careful about what we mean by that term, but there may well be things that we build into our way of talking about our Orthodox faith, which can actually be not so much modified as perhaps modified is the right term, that we can actually see more deeply into what we mean by these things. One example is the whole concept of tradition. We often talk about tradition as though it was a simple, straightforward block of knowledge, whereas in fact a lot of patristic scholars nowadays recognize that tradition is something much more subtle. It is the work of the Holy Spirit in the Church, and that, as Metropolitan Kostas once put it, we do need to be able to separate what he calls patristic wheat from patristic chaff. Very simple example of that. The patristic wheat is obviously there in much of the thinking of St. John Chrysostom, but he also believed in a flat earth as far as we can tell. He certainly talked about the way in which if the Antipodes existed, then human beings couldn't possibly exist there. Well, tell that to an Australian nowadays. So obviously, if we read St. John Chrysostom, we can't read everything that he wrote on exactly the same level. So we can actually think through this concept of tradition in a way which I think can be very helpful to us. But as I say, this notion that there is a core and that there is this auxiliary sort of grey area is one I think that Orthodox do need to grapple with, and it seems to me that many patristic scholars in the Orthodox Church are now beginning to do that, and I see that as a very hopeful sign.
As a final question, which thinkers, intellectuals or scholars would you identify as being especially prominent in the contemporary science and Eastern Christianity tradition interaction? Apart from you.
Well, as I've said earlier, it does seem to me that Alexei Nestoruk is providing some important insights, though I do think that it sometimes leads him in directions which I personally wouldn't want to go. But he certainly is providing some very interesting things there. There are others who have written on specific Orthodox themes. Archbishop Lazar Puhalo, for example, he hasn't written anything in a systematic way about science and theology, but he has written a number of short essays or sometimes very short books which focus on particular issues. For example, he's written on the neurobiology of sin, the whole question of how we think about sin in an era in which we have neurobiological insights into some of the ways in which humans fall short of the ideal to which they're called. So he, for example, would be an example of that. I think there are some patristic scholars, Father Doru Kostache, for example, who have seen, particularly in the tradition of Romanian Orthodoxy, ways in which there has been an encouragement within that tradition to look at the whole rich tradition of Orthodox thinking about the creation and to express it in terms of modern science. There again, it seems to be something very, very positive, and we do need people like him who have real patristic expertise to help us to think through these issues in relation to the patristic literature. I make no claim to being a patristic scholar in that sense. I've focused most of my life on the modern dialogue between science and theology. Obviously, as an Orthodox, I've tried to understand the patristic witness, but it does seem to me that scholars who have focused primarily on the patristic witness, but are also interested in this whole area, have a really important part to play. So there is an important patristic strand to the modern Orthodox relationship to science.
I would like to thank you once more for providing us the chance to discuss this issue with you. I would like to thank you for your time and for your hospitality here in Cambridge. And I do hope that even unofficially we will have the chance again to discuss these issues. Thank you very, very much.
You.